Stand at the edge of a mine shaft in Virginia City, Nevada, and look down. You see nothing. Just blackness, swallowing blackness, a hole in the earth that drops farther than your eyes can follow. 3,300 feet straight down. That's taller than 3 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other, punched into solid rock. Now here's what should keep you up at night. Men dug that hole, not machines, not explosives alone. Men with hammers and steel rods, pounding into granite and quartz 1 inch at a time, 1 inch per hour in the hardest rock. They did the math and swung anyway. They descended into darkness so complete that their candles became the only proof the sun had ever existed. They worked in temperatures that reached 170 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas where the rock itself was too hot to touch with bare hands. They breathed air so thick with dust that their lungs turned white before they turned 40. And they did this for $4 a day. Between 1859 and 1880, American miners extracted over $400 million in silver and gold from the Comstock lode. That's the equivalent of $12 billion today. Pulled from the belly of a mountain using technology that belonged more to the Bronze Age than the Industrial Revolution. The single jack. The double jack. A steel drill held by hand while someone swung a hammer at it over and over, creating holes in rock so that black powder could split the earth apart. This is the story of how America built 1,000-foot mine shafts using nothing but hand drills, human muscle, and a tolerance for death that we cannot comprehend today. This is the story of the men who went down into the dark and never came back up. And this is the story of what we owe them, a debt we have never paid and never acknowledged. To understand what happened beneath Virginia City, you first need to understand what happened above it. In January of 1848, James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in California. Within 2 years, 300,000 people flooded into the territory, scratching at rivers and hillsides, pulling wealth from the earth with pans and sluice boxes. But placer gold, the easy gold, runs out. By the mid-1850s, the streams were picked clean. The easy money was gone, so the miners started walking east, crossing the Sierra Nevada, looking for the next strike. They found it in the spring of 1859, in a desolate canyon on the eastern slope of Mount Davidson. 2 Irish miners named Patrick McLaughlin and Peter O'Reilly were working a small claim when they hit something strange. The gold they were finding was mixed with a heavy blue-black mud that clogged their equipment and made processing nearly impossible. They cursed it. They tried to wash it away. That blue-black mud was silver sulfide. It was the richest silver ore ever discovered in American history. Within months, a prospector named Henry Comstock had talked and bullied his way into partial ownership of the claim. He didn't discover anything. He simply showed up and demanded a share, and the original discoverers were too exhausted to fight him. History remembers it as the Comstock lode anyway. That's how it goes sometimes. The loudest voice gets the name. Word spread fast. By the summer of 1859, thousands of men were pouring over the mountains into what would become Virginia City. They came from the played-out California goldfields. They came from the farms of the Midwest. They came from Ireland and Germany and Cornwall, England, where men had been mining tin and copper for generations. The Cornish miners, the Cousin Jacks as they were called, brought something the Americans desperately needed. They brought knowledge. They knew how to go deep. And deep was exactly where the silver lived. The surface deposits of the Comstock played out within the first year. The easy pickings disappeared just like they had in California. But unlike California, the ore didn't stop. It just went down. Geologists would later determine that the Comstock lode was a massive vein of silver and gold that descended thousands of feet into the earth, a treasure chest buried so deep that reaching it would require engineering that didn't exist yet. The miners would have to invent it as they went. This is where our story truly begins, not with discovery, but with descent. The first Comstock shafts were simple affairs, holes dug with pickaxes and shovels, following the ore wherever it led. These early workings rarely went deeper than 50 or 100 feet. The rock was relatively soft near the surface, decomposed by centuries of weathering. A strong man with a pick could make real progress. But as the miners descended, the rock changed. The soft stuff gave way to hard volcanic basalt and dense quartz. Picks bounced off it. Shovels were useless. This is when the drilling began. Picture the tool itself. A single jack drill was a steel rod about 18 inches long, with a chisel point at one end. The steel was specially hardened, tempered to hold an edge against rock that would destroy ordinary metal. The blacksmiths who forged these drills were artists in their own right, heating the steel to precise temperatures, quenching it in oil or water at exactly the right moment to achieve the perfect balance of hardness and toughness. Too hard, and the drill would shatter against the rock. Too soft, and it would mushroom and dull within minutes. Getting it right was the difference between progress and wasted effort. A miner would grip this drill in one hand, holding it against the rock face at the exact angle needed. In his other hand, he held a 4-pound hammer. And then he started swinging. One blow, rotate the drill slightly, another blow, rotate again. Over and over, hundreds of times, thousands of times, the hammer striking steel, the steel biting into rock, the hole deepening by fractions of an inch. In hard quartz, a skilled single jack man could drill 1 inch per hour. 1 inch. In 60 minutes of continuous labor, in air thick with rock dust, in light so dim that the walls seemed to breathe, a man could create a hole the depth of his thumb. Now multiply that by 1,000 feet. The mathematics of single jacking are brutal. To drill a single blast hole 3 feet deep, a miner would need 3 hours of continuous work. A typical round of blasting required 8 to 12 holes, positioned precisely to fracture the rock in the most efficient pattern. That's 24 to 36 hours of drilling for a single blast, which might advance the tunnel face by 3 or 4 feet if everything went perfectly. The blasting itself was another dance with death. Black powder was the explosive of choice, packed into the drilled holes and tamped down with clay and wooden plugs. The fuses were simple affairs, cotton cord soaked in potassium nitrate, burning at a rate the miners could only estimate. You lit your fuses, you counted your seconds, and you ran. If you miscounted, if a fuse burned fast, if you tripped in the darkness, you didn't get a second chance. The powder men who handled explosives were paid extra, but they rarely lived long enough to enjoy it. A single spark from a steel tool striking rock could ignite loose powder. A single miscalculation in tamping could cause a blowback that turned a drill hole into a cannon barrel pointed at whoever was standing in front of it. It almost never went perfectly. The rock varied constantly. One section might be relatively soft, allowing good progress. The next might be dense black basalt that laughed at steel and broke drill bits like twigs. Water seeped through cracks, flooding the holes, requiring constant bailing. The air grew thick with dust, with moisture, with heat. And always, always, there was the danger of the ground itself. Miners call it working in bad ground. It means exactly what you think it means. The rock above you is unstable. It shifts, it groans, it falls. In the early Comstock mines, before the engineering solutions were developed, cave-ins killed miners weekly. The ore body itself was the problem. The silver was deposited in irregular masses and pockets, not in neat parallel veins. To extract it, miners had to excavate enormous underground chambers, sometimes 80 feet wide and hundreds of feet long. These chambers had no natural support. The weight of the mountain pressed down on them with millions of tons of force, and sooner or later, the mountain won. This brings us to Philipp Deidesheimer, a German engineer who arrived in Virginia City in 1860. He took one look at the existing mining methods and saw exactly why men were dying. The miners were trying to support massive excavations with single timbers, essentially building underground log cabins that crumbled under pressure they were never designed to handle. Deidesheimer's solution was elegant and revolutionary. He invented a system called square-set timbering. Instead of individual supports, he designed interlocking cubes of timber, each cube 6 feet on a side. These cubes could be stacked in any direction, up, down, sideways, following the irregular shape of the ore body. They locked together like three-dimensional puzzle pieces, each cube supporting its neighbors, distributing the immense pressure across the entire structure rather than concentrating it on single points. The square set system worked. Mine collapses dropped dramatically. Miners could now excavate chambers of any size and shape, filling the empty space behind them with cubes of timber as they advanced. The mountain's weight was held at bay by a skeleton of wood, a framework that flexed and groaned but did not break. There was just one problem. The square set system consumed timber at a rate that defied belief. Virginia City sat on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, in high desert terrain where trees were scarce. The nearest significant forests were on the western slope, across the mountains in California. To feed the Comstock's hunger for timber, an entire industry had to be created from nothing. The scale of destruction is difficult to comprehend. Logging camps sprang up across the Sierra Nevada, employing thousands of men who had their own brutal work to perform. They felled trees that had stood for 1,000 years, ancient sugar pines and ponderosas with trunks 6 feet in diameter. A single tree might yield enough lumber to build an entire house. These trees were cut down by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, until entire mountainsides stood bare. Getting that timber to Virginia City required engineering almost as impressive as the mines themselves. The Sierra Nevada rises steeply from the California valleys, with peaks exceeding 10,000 feet. Traditional transportation methods were useless. You couldn't drive wagon trains over those passes in winter, and you couldn't wait for summer when the mines needed timber year-round. So they built flumes. These were V-shaped wooden channels, essentially artificial rivers that ran down the mountainsides carrying lumber on currents of diverted stream water. The flumes twisted for miles through canyons and across ridges, dropping thousands of feet in elevation, delivering timber to collection points where it could be loaded onto trains and wagons for the final journey to Virginia City. The flume riders were their own breed of madmen. Someone had to travel the flumes to clear jams and maintain the channels. They rowed small boats down these wooden rivers, hurtling through the darkness of mountain nights at speeds that would terrify a modern whitewater rafter. Some of them died when boats capsized or broke apart. Some of them died when flumes collapsed beneath them. Their names are even less remembered than the miners they supplied. At its peak, the Comstock lode consumed 80 million board feet of timber every single year. To put that in perspective, a typical American house uses about 15,000 board feet of lumber. 80 million board feet could build over 5,000 houses annually. And it all went underground, into the darkness, to hold open tunnels that would eventually flood and collapse and be forgotten. The forests never recovered. If you drive through parts of the Sierra Nevada today, you'll see second-growth timber, trees planted in the 1890s and early 1900s after the original forests were gone. The ancient trees, the ones that watched the glaciers retreat and the first humans arrive, those are gone forever. They're holding up mine tunnels 3,000 feet underground, slowly rotting in the darkness, forgotten. But the timber solved only part of the problem. As the mines deepened, the single jack method became impossibly slow. Drilling by hand was adequate for shallow workings, but as shafts pushed past 500 feet, past 1,000 feet, past 2,000 feet, every minute of drilling time translated into hours of additional danger. The longer men stayed underground, the more likely they were to be crushed, burned, drowned, or suffocated. So the miners evolved. They developed the double jack. The double jack required 2 men working in absolute coordination. One man sat or crouched, holding the steel drill with both hands, keeping it perfectly steady against the rock face. The other man stood over him with an 8-pound sledgehammer. And then he started swinging. 8 pounds doesn't sound like much. Pick up a gallon of milk and feel its weight. Now imagine swinging that weight at full force, over and over, hour after hour. The double jack man wasn't swinging like someone driving a nail. He was swinging with his entire body, generating maximum velocity, bringing the hammer down on a steel rod that his partner held perhaps 6 inches from his own hands. Think about the trust required. One missed swing, and the drill holder's hands would be crushed. We're at one moment of poor judgment, one slip in the smoky darkness, and a man loses his livelihood, his fingers, perhaps his life. The double jack teams developed an almost telepathic coordination. a rhythm so precise that they could swing in total darkness, the holder rotating the drill by feel between blows, the striker timing his swings to the sound of his partner's breathing. In hard rock, a good double jack team could drill 3 inches per hour, 3 times faster than single jacking. It doesn't sound like much of an improvement, but over the course of a shift, over the course of a week, over the course of a year, that difference meant everything. It meant fewer hours in the killing heat. It meant faster progress toward ore that could be extracted and sold. It meant survival for some of them, for a little while longer. The Cornish miners were the acknowledged masters of double jack drilling. They had been doing it in the tin mines of Cornwall for generations, and they brought their techniques to Nevada along with their songs, their superstitions, and their pasties, the meat-filled pastries they carried underground for lunch. The pasty was designed for mining life. It had a thick, crimped edge that a man could hold with dirty hands and then throw away, so he wouldn't ingest the arsenic and other poisons that coated everything in the tunnels. A Cornish double jack team could drill holes so straight and true that they seemed machine-made. They could work a seam of ore in ways that maximized extraction while minimizing the risk of collapse. They were artists of the underground, and they taught the American-born miners everything they knew. The drilling competitions became legend. On holidays, and sometimes just on slow Sundays, the mining camps would hold contests to see which team could drill the deepest hole in a set time. These weren't casual affairs. Prize money could exceed a month's wages. More importantly, reputation was at stake. A champion double jack team could name their price with any mining company on the Comstock. The rules were strict. Each team got 15 minutes. The rock block was inspected to ensure consistent hardness. The steel drills were weighed and measured. At the signal, the striker began his assault on the rock, and the holder began his prayer that today wouldn't be the day his partner's aim failed. The best teams could drill over 40 inches in 15 minutes, a rate that made their everyday work pace look like leisure. The crowds roared. The betting was fierce, and occasionally, tragically, a holder would miscalculate, would move the drill at the wrong moment, would take an 8-pound hammer to the back of his hand, and end his career in a spray of blood and bone. Even the winners rarely celebrated for long. The money went to drink, mostly. The Comstock had over 100 saloons at its peak, and miners fresh off shift drank to forget where they'd been and what they'd done. They drank to numb the pain in their shoulders and backs. They drank to silence the coughing that kept them up at night. They drank because they knew, in some deep and unspoken part of themselves, that they were trading their lives for $4 a day, and there was nothing else to do about it but drink. The boarding houses where they lived were little better than the mines themselves. Men slept in shifts, 3 miners sharing a single bed that was never cold and never clean. The sheets were changed monthly if the landlady was conscientious, less often if she wasn't. The food was beans and bread and salt pork, eaten quickly at communal tables before the next shift headed down. There was no privacy, no quiet, no escape from the constant presence of other men who smelled like you, who coughed like you, who would probably die like you. The married men had it marginally better. They might rent a small house or a room of their own. Their wives would cook and clean and try to create something resembling normal life on the side of a mountain where normal life did not exist. The children of Virginia City grew up knowing that their fathers went into the earth every day and might not come back. They learned to recognize the whistle that signaled a mine accident, the one long blast that meant death below. They learned to watch their mothers' faces when the whistle blew, to see the fear that lasted until their fathers walked through the door. Not all of them survived to collect that $4. Here's what you need to understand about deep mining in the 19th century. Everything wanted to kill you. The rock wanted to kill you. The water wanted to kill you. The air wanted to kill you. And the heat, the infernal, impossible heat, the heat wanted to kill you most of all. As the Comstock shafts descended past 1,000 feet, temperatures began to rise. The deeper you go into the earth, the hotter it gets. This is called the geothermal gradient, and in Virginia City it was exceptionally steep. So by the time shafts reached 2,000 feet, rock temperatures exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit. At 3,000 feet, some areas recorded temperatures of 170 degrees. Think about what that means. The human body maintains a core temperature of around 98.6 degrees. In an environment of 130 degrees, your body cannot shed heat through sweating because the air is already hotter than your skin. You absorb heat from the rock, from the air, from the very ground beneath your feet. Your core temperature rises. Your heart races. Your brain begins to malfunction. Without intervention, you die. The mining companies developed elaborate systems to keep men alive in these conditions. They stationed barrels of ice water throughout the deep workings. Miners would strip naked, work for 15 or 20 minutes, then plunge themselves into the ice water to bring their temperatures down. They wore canvas suits soaked in water that evaporated and provided brief cooling. They worked in shifts so short that men were constantly rotating between the deep levels and the surface. The ice itself had to be transported from the Sierra Nevada, cut from frozen lakes in winter, stored in insulated warehouses, and delivered daily to the mines. At the peak of deep mining operations, Virginia City consumed over 100 tons of ice per day, most of it destined for the depths. The ice wagons became as regular a sight as the ore wagons, a bizarre counterflow of cold descending, while heat and silver ascended. Even with these precautions, heat killed. Miners collapsed in the tunnels, their bodies literally cooking from the inside. Others survived the heat only to develop chronic conditions that killed them years later. Hearts damaged by repeated stress, lungs destroyed by the hot, dust-filled air. The doctors called it miner's consumption. The miners called it a slow death. And then there was the water. The Comstock lode sat atop an enormous underground aquifer. As shafts descended, they inevitably broke into water-bearing strata. The water flooded in, filling tunnels faster than men could escape. In the early days, before proper pumping systems were installed, entire workings had to be abandoned because the water won. The solution was industrial-scale pumping on a scale never before attempted. The mining companies installed massive Cornish pumps, beam engines that could lift thousands of gallons per minute from the deepest levels. These engines were engineering marvels, with cylinders 6 feet in diameter and beams that weighed tons. They ran on steam, generated by boilers that burned cord after cord of wood, adding to the Comstock's insatiable timber appetite. One man saw a different solution. Adolf Sutro, a German immigrant with more ambition than capital, proposed a tunnel that would run horizontally into Mount Davidson from the valley below, intersecting the mine shafts at the 1,600-foot level. This tunnel would drain the water by gravity, eliminating the need for pumps. It would also provide ventilation, reducing the heat that killed miners on the deep levels. And it would create a safe escape route in case of fire or collapse. The mining companies fought Sutro for years. They didn't want to share their wealth with an outsider. They didn't believe his tunnel would work. They used their political influence to block his financing and delay his permits. But Sutro persisted. He raised money in Europe. He lobbied Congress. He started digging in 1869 and didn't stop for 9 years. The Sutro Tunnel was completed in 1878. Nearly 4 miles of horizontal passage through solid rock. It worked exactly as Sutro had promised. Water drained from the mines. Temperatures dropped on the lower levels. Men could escape through the tunnel when accidents blocked the shafts above. But Sutro had won too late. By the time his tunnel was finished, the richest ore bodies had already been extracted. The mines were beginning their long decline. And Sutro sold his interest and moved to San Francisco, where he made another fortune in real estate. His tunnel continued operating for decades, but it never generated the wealth he had imagined when he first started swinging a pick at the mountain. The pump stations themselves became death traps of their own design. The water that came up was hot, sometimes scalding, heated by the same geothermal forces that cooked the miners. It carried dissolved minerals that corroded metal and poisoned anyone who swallowed it. The pump chambers themselves reached temperatures that made the regular working seem comfortable by comparison. Men who tended the pumps worked in conditions that would kill an unacclimated person within minutes, and the pumps broke, they broke constantly, seals failed, valves corroded, bearings seized. When a pump failed, the water rose with terrifying speed, sometimes filling hundreds of feet of tunnel within hours. The pump repair crews were considered the bravest workers in the mines. They descended into flooded workings, sometimes swimming through hot water to reach the machinery, making repairs while the water continued to rise around them. A man named Patrick Larkin became legendary for his pump rescues. 3 times he swam into flooded pump stations to make repairs that saved the lower workings from being permanently lost. The 3rd time, in 1873, the water was over 120 degrees. He made the repair, saved the pump, and came out with burns over 40% of his body. He died 3 weeks later. The company paid his widow $50. Let me tell you about the dying. Between 1859 and 1880, at least 300 men died in the Comstock mines from accidents alone. Cave-ins crushed them, falls broke them, fires burned them alive in tunnels that became chimneys for flames that fed on timber and human flesh alike. Premature explosions from blasting powder tore them apart, scattering pieces of men across rock faces that their partners would have to clean before work could resume. We know some of their names. John Exley, killed in the Yellow Jacket Fire of 1869, one of 45 men who died when flames swept through the connected workings of 3 major mines. The fire started from an overturned candle fed on the timber supports and created a chimney effect that sucked air through the tunnels at hurricane speed. Men died from smoke inhalation, from burns, from falling as they tried to climb through the chaos. The recovery teams found bodies fused to the rock, cooked in place by heat that exceeded anything the living had ever experienced. William Comerford, age 23, crushed in a cave-in at the Consolidated Virginia in 1874. His partner survived to describe the sound, a groaning from the timber that lasted only a second before the roof came down. Comerford was carrying a drill at the time. They found it 6 feet from his body, driven into the floor by the force of the collapse. Manuel Santos, a Portuguese immigrant, drowned in a pump failure at the Ophir in 1877. The water rose so fast that he and 3 others were trapped in a dead-end drift with no escape. Rescuers could hear them pounding on the rock for over an hour before the sound stopped. It took 2 weeks to pump out the water. They found Santos with his fingernails torn off. From clawing at the walls, 300 dead in accidents. But that number is a lie. It doesn't count the men who died slowly, the ones whose lungs filled with silica dust until they couldn't breathe, the ones whose hearts gave out from years of heat stress, the ones who developed cancers from the arsenic and mercury used in processing, the ones who drank themselves to death to forget what they had seen underground, what they had done, what had been done to them. The silicosis was worst. They called it miner's consumption, but it was really just drowning in slow motion. Every breath in the tunnels brought rock dust into the lungs. The dust particles were tiny, invisible, and sharp as glass. They lodged in the lung tissue and never came out. Over years, scar tissue built up around them. The lungs lost their elasticity. Breathing became harder and harder. Men who had swung 8-pound hammers for 10-hour shifts found themselves winded walking upstairs. By the end, they couldn't lie down without suffocating on fluid that built up when they were horizontal. They died sitting up, gasping, drowning in their own bodies. If you count the slow deaths, the ones that took months or years instead of seconds, the real death toll of the Comstock load is probably 10 times higher. 3,000 men? Maybe more. We'll never know exactly. Nobody was counting. Nobody cared enough to count. The companies kept meticulous records of ore extracted and profits earned. They kept records of timber consumed and pumps installed. They kept records of stock prices and dividends paid, but they did not keep records of lungs destroyed. They did not keep records of families orphaned. They did not keep records of the human cost of pulling silver from the earth at 1 inch per hour. I want you to understand what this looked like. I want you to close your eyes and be there. You descend the main shaft in a cage, a wooden platform suspended by cables. The cable runs through a wheel at the top of the headframe, down into darkness. The cage drops fast, faster than feels safe, the walls of the shaft blurring past in the dim light of your candle. You feel the air growing warmer as you descend. At 500 feet, it's noticeably hotter. At 1,000 feet, sweat begins to pour from your body. At 2,000 feet, The heat presses against you like a physical weight. The cage stops. You step out into a tunnel carved from solid rock. The ceiling is 7 feet high, supported by massive timber beams already beginning to splinter under the mountain's weight. The floor is wet, covered in a film of hot water that seeps from cracks in the rock. The walls shimmer with moisture. You can see perhaps 20 feet in front of you, the range of your candle. Beyond that, total darkness. You hear the constant drip of water, the creak of timber, the distant boom of blasting from another level. You smell sulfur and sweat, and something else, something organic. The smell of men working themselves to death. You reach the face where your team is drilling. 2 men are already there, stripped to the waist, bodies glistening with sweat, muscles standing out like cables. One holds the drill, the other lifts the hammer. The sound is rhythmic, hypnotic. Clang, rotate, clang, rotate, clang. You take your position. And you grip the drill. The steel is warm from the rock. Your partner raises the hammer. You close your eyes and trust. This is what they did. Every day, every shift, for years. The silver that came out of the Comstock lode built San Francisco. It funded the Union cause in the Civil War. It created fortunes that echoed through American history for generations. The Big Four who built the Transcontinental Railroad, they got their start in Comstock silver. The banks that would become Wells Fargo, they grew fat on Comstock deposits. The mansions on Nob Hill, the opera houses, the libraries, the universities, all of it traces back to silver pulled from Nevada rock at 1 inch per hour. And the men who did the pulling? Most of them died poor. They made $4 a day, which was good money in 1865, enough to live on. Maybe enough to send a little home to family back east or across the ocean. But the work broke them. They rarely lasted more than 5 or 10 years before their bodies gave out. The lucky ones found other work. The unlucky ones found graves. Virginia City peaked in 1877 with a population of over 25,000 people. It was the most important city between Denver and San Francisco, a metropolis of wealth and vice and ambition perched on a mountainside above the richest hole in the earth. It had 6 churches and 110 saloons. It had an opera house that hosted touring companies from New York and London. It had mansions with running water and central heating, luxuries that most Americans couldn't imagine. And then the silver began to run out. The great bonanzas played out one by one. The big bonanza, discovered in 1873, yielded over $105 million before it was exhausted. When it was gone, there was nothing to replace it. The shafts pushed deeper and deeper, following traces of ore that grew thinner with every foot. The mines that had paid fortunes now barely covered their operating costs. The pumps ran slower. The timber shipments decreased. The men began to leave. By 1890, Virginia City's population had dropped to less than 9,000. By 1900, it was under 3,000. The great mines closed one by one, their shafts sealed, their machinery sold for scrap, their tunnels filling with the water that had always been waiting to reclaim them. Virginia City itself is a ghost now, a tourist attraction where visitors can tour the upper levels of abandoned mines and buy souvenirs made of Comstock ore. The deep levels are flooded, soon have been flooded for over a century. The pumps stopped when the silver ran out. The water rose. It took back what had been taken from it. But down there, 3,000 feet below the gift shops and the guided tours, the timber cubes are still holding. The square sets that Philip Deidesheimer designed in 1860 are still doing their job, still pressing back against the mountain, still holding open spaces where men once swung hammers in the dark. The wood has mineralized in places, turned partly to stone by the same chemical processes that created the silver in the first place. It will last for thousands of years. It may last forever. And scattered among the timbers, in the flooded tunnels and collapsed chambers, there are bones. We don't know how many. We don't know whose. The recovery teams couldn't reach every body after every accident, and some were sealed behind cave-ins. Some were carried away by floods. Some were simply left, their retrieval deemed too dangerous, their lives valued less than the cost of the rescue. They're still there. The men who drilled the 1,000-foot shafts. The men who held the steel while their partners swung. The men who died at 1 inch per hour. We owe them something. I'm not sure what. Monuments, maybe. Virginia City has a few small markers that visitors walk past without reading. Museums preserve their tools, the single jacks and double jacks displayed behind glass where children on field trips can ignore them. But what we really owe them is memory. We owe them the knowledge that this happened, that human beings did this, that the silver and gold we take for granted, the wealth that built the American West, came at a price measured in men's lives, in men's lungs, in men's crushed hands and broken bodies. The next time you see something built of metal, something pulled from the earth, something that required someone to go down into the dark and bring it back up, I want you to think about them. I want you to think about the heat and the dust and the sound of hammers on steel echoing through tunnels that no longer exist. I want you to think about $4 a day. I want you to think about 1 inch per hour. They went down so we could build up. That's the bargain of progress. Someone always pays. Someone always descends. And most of the time, we never learn their names. The Comstock lode produced over $400 million in its first 2 decades of operation. It made kings of men who never swung a hammer, who never felt the heat of a 3,000-foot level, who never trusted their hands to a partner in the dark. Those men had their names carved in marble. Their mansions still stand. Their foundations still give grants and fund scholarships. The men who did the actual work, their names are scattered through company payroll records, through cemetery plots in Virginia City, through immigration documents at Ellis Island, and ship manifests at San Francisco. Patrick, Sean, Wilhelm, Giovanni, names from every corner of the world, carried to a mountainside in Nevada, left there when the bodies gave out. Single jack, double jack, 1 inch per hour, 1,000 feet down. That's how America built its wealth. That's how the West was really won. There's a cemetery in Virginia City, up on the hill, where the wind blows cold even in summer. The graves face west, toward the mountains that provided the timber, toward the California that many of these men had left behind. The headstones that remain are weathered, their inscriptions fading. Many graves have no stones at all, just depressions in the earth where wooden markers rotted away a century ago. If you walk among those graves, you'll notice something. The death dates cluster. 1869, the year of the Yellow Jacket fire. 1873, when the deepest levels first hit the killing heat. 1877 and 1878, when the pumps failed twice in the same winter. These men didn't die of old age. They didn't die surrounded by grandchildren who knew their stories. They died young and hard and fast, and then the world moved on without them. Some of them left descendants who still live in Nevada, still carry names like Comerford and Exley and Santos. These descendants know, in a general way, that their ancestors were miners. They might have a photograph, a drill bit kept as a memento, a story passed down about great-grandfather who worked the Comstock, but the specifics are lost. The daily reality of what those men endured has faded into family legend, simplified into something bearable. The truth isn't bearable. The truth is men holding steel while hammers swung at their fingers in darkness. The truth is lungs filling with rock dust over years, until breathing became impossible. The truth is $4 a day for work that destroyed bodies and shortened lives and built an empire that never acknowledged the cost. That's how America built its wealth. That's how the West was really won. And that's what I want you to remember.